Welcome to the History of the United States lecture. Today we're going to be talking about, trying to narrow the lecture to focus on the Declaration of Independence as a key document in U.S. history. And in a recent trip to Washington, I happened to pick up the actual copy of the Declaration. Just slipped it out of a case in the National Archives. No, this isn't the actual one. I'm not Nick Cage in whatever that movie was, where he stole the Constitution, the Declaration, whatever he stole. But anyways, this is a copy of the Declaration. It's one of the most significant documents, not only in U.S. history but in world history. We'll see that in a few moments. It's a document that at the time when it was being written, nobody really wanted to do it. It was kind of sloughed around to different people. A committee of five individuals: John Adams, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. The committee of five were put together to write this thing. But even those guys kind of bantered it back and forth, and it ended up falling on the lap of Thomas Jefferson, who at the age of 33 wrote most of this document. It did go through some revision and editing by that committee, and then later Congress, which represented all the 13 colonies or 13 states, as they were increasingly becoming known as. But generally speaking, it's pretty well the document that Jefferson wrote. So on his tombstone, when he died, he had etched on there a couple things, but one of the things it said, the top of the list was, "Here lies Thomas Jefferson, who's responsible for writing the Declaration of Independence." So by the end of his life, this document became of great significance and remains so to this day. And here's the key line that's often used. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, what's interesting is at this particular time in history, the history of the United States, 1776, 1/5 of the population of the United States was enslaved. And Jefferson himself owned over 100 individuals as enslaved people. And so there's something, again, we've been talking already about this, the last number of lectures, about the paradoxes and contradictions of the United States. And this is one of the greatest ones, that when they said all men are created equal, or all people are created equal, this excludes, of course, women, non-white people who are entirely left out, and indigenous communities. In fact, at times in the document, if you read that in your primary source packet, I've given you a copy of the Declaration on discovery, that Native peoples are referred to disparagingly. Now, Thomas Jefferson did include a section on slavery, actually. The document does two things. I'll say this. What the Declaration does essentially is it establishes the concept of natural rights, inalienable rights, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. The philosophical question, how is that based, or how is that founded? But the other thing this does, most of the document, is a list of grievances that the colonies, or the 13 colonies, or the 13 states as they were becoming known, grievances that they had with the king, King George III. And in those lists of grievances, the one that was struck out by Congress, one that they decided to get rid of, the Continental Congress, was this idea that the king, King George III, was responsible for the slave trade and was preventing America from ending slavery. Now, the first thing is that that's not actually true. King George III wasn't forbidding the Americans from ending slavery or whatnot. In fact, as we saw, and in your readings, it talked about the fact that American economy, especially in the southern states, were intimately connected and dependent on slavery, slave labor. But Congress didn't want any reference at all to slavery, so it was struck out, and that's a telling point of history that even Jefferson, who owned slaves, saw in many ways that this was a immoral or not a good practice. Um, so as we consider the thread, the major thread, in fact, it's more than a thread, it's really a pillar, a sad and tragic and shameful pillar in U.S. history. This stream, I guess you could say, of slavery, over 200 years of slavery in U.S. history, um, is that all throughout there were people, individuals who considered slavery to be repugnant, to be not a legitimate system. Many of the founding fathers, George Washington, who was also a slave owner, and many of the founding fathers were slave owners, in a way believed that slavery would simply phase out. It would just fade out eventually and disappear on its own cause. It didn't do that. It required essentially for it to come to a head in the Civil War, a major conflict, which had a number of causes and a number of agendas. But one of the primary reasons for the Civil War is the issue of slavery. There are others as well, federalism versus confederation, in terms of two political approaches to how the United States should be unified and governed. A strong federal government versus strong state governments. That's certainly part of it. But slavery was a major issue. And Abraham Lincoln, with his Emancipation Proclamation, finally put an end to slavery. Did not put an end to racism, discrimination. Later on in the course, we'll get to the Civil Rights Movement, Martin Luther King Jr., in the 1960s. So 100 years after emancipation, still Black Americans were experiencing discrimination and limited opportunities, and so on and so forth. So it's a long process coming to terms with the issues of slaverism, the issues of slavery, the counter issues of abolition, the civil rights movement. These are the threads that we'll look at. But to even talk about civil rights, to even talk about these ideas, it stems back to this document. The Constitution as well, and we'll talk a little bit about the Constitution on this lecture as well, but the Declaration of Independence was the key document, which set all these other civil rights movements and all these other issues on the road to transformation, and placing the United States as a world leader of equality and anti-discrimination laws and all these things begins with this particular document. Okay, well, let's begin talking about our main focus during this lecture. History is not only what happened, what events occurred, and that's what you're getting primarily from the readings. You're getting a good overview of some of the key events. The readings that we saw there dealt with the issues of the actual Revolutionary War and some of the turning points in that conflict between this ragtag army, colonial army, versus the mighty British army, highly disciplined, arguably the world's greatest fighting force at that time, significant presence, and yet the Americans were able to successfully defeat the British and earn their independence. So history is not just simply what actually occurred or even how those events occurred, but also why things occurred. And that's the interesting part, I think, for many historians, as we go beyond getting the facts right and what happened, but also, analyzing and trying to interpret why things happen. And so we are going to spill into some philosophical thinking as well. But thought and belief determine what people do. And this is what I think is most interesting about the United States and the 13 colonies. Because just, it seems a few years prior to the Declaration of Independence, a few years prior to the Revolutionary War, most people in the colonies were ardent royalists. They were loyal to the crown. And so what shifted is the question. What caused people to make a shift and take up arms against the motherland, as it were, and even take up arms between each other? The Civil War is not the only place where brother fought against brother. It also happened in the Revolutionary War, where families were divided along lines of loyalty. And there's all sorts of examples where people are picking sides. Do you remain loyal to the crown? Do you stay loyal to, are you a patriot? Are you loyal to the American cause? And so we want to explore and consider thought and belief. We tend to do what we believe. What we believe is what we do, I think is a general statement. Um, and so trying to understand what was the belief, what caused the belief that resulted in this war of independence. And this is a debatable point because we're trying to dig deep into things that aren't necessarily clear or obvious. It's hard to find artifact or concrete evidence of these things. But remember, history, again, the sort of working definition that I like to use, is a history is a series of arguments to be debated, not a body of data to be recorded or a set of facts to be memorized. So we are going to, some of the things that we're going to discuss here are debatable and will remain so in the future, particularly as more evidence comes to light. So the Declaration of Independence, this is going to be our focus during this particular lecture. And as I mentioned to you, at first, no one wanted to write this document. It wasn't considered very important at the time. But eventually, it becomes one of the most important documents in US history, but also world history. And here's just a smattering of examples of influences. It's quoted by during the French Revolution. It influenced the Latin American wars for independence from Spain. It also was paraphrased by Ho Chi Minh during the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence from France in 1945. And so this is just a smattering of examples where the Declaration helped lead or result in subsequent nations rebelling against their royal oversight or rebelling against colonial rule, as is the case of Latin America, France, who overthrew their absolute monarchy, and Ho Chi Minh, who rejected French colonial rule post World War II. And then, of course, in United States history, it was quoted heavily by one of the most famous abolitionists, William Lloyd Garrison, who used the Declaration repeatedly as a case for why slavery should be abolished in the United States. It influenced other rights movements, for example, the women's rights movements. It's paraphrased in the Declaration of Sentiments for women's rights. And what they do is they actually take that famous statement, we hold these truths to be self-evident, and they add that all men and women are created equal, and they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they actually structure where the Declaration creates a list of indictments against King George III. This Women's Rights Convention document, this declaration document, creates a list of indictments against males who have oppressed women and limited their ability to achieve various things. It's paraphrased the Gettysburg Address and alluded to the Emancipation Proclamation, and Martin Luther King Jr., as I've already alluded to, refers to and references and alludes to the Declaration in his famous I Have a Dream speech, and it drove a lot of the civil rights movement. So the question is, what led or what caused the 13 colonies to make a radical decision to declare independence from England? In January 1776, independence was still a fringe idea. So within a few months, essentially, what caused the colonies, the colonials, to make this decision and to embrace this Declaration of Independence in particular. As we know, the Declaration did not appear in a vacuum, literally a vacuum cleaner there, did not occur in a vacuum, that these things have a long run, and there's often intellectual and historical events that precede the events. And so there's a cause and effect understanding of history. You have to be careful for this, that you don't wind up with non sequiturs or wind up with false causation or false correlation. In the most immediate sense, when we talk about the Declaration of Independence and the War for Independence, the American Revolution, it also did not occur in a vacuum. On the surface, there are some number of key things here. This is just a reminder here of the three main colonial presence: the Spanish, the French, the English in North America. There's the 13 colonies there on the coast. And there's a zoom in again of the 13 colonies, the original 13 that existed. And so, again, the causes of conflict between these two particular, um, the Americans, each colony, again, calling themselves states. That was a key sort of linguistic shift, but also unifying under this Continental Congress, unifying together and saying we stand together as 13 colonies with a common cause, and we stand against the British. We stand against the English control over our region. So there's, again, some immediate causes. But again, what we want to see as we go through this is that what did people believe and think that enabled them to rebel against their king? Um, this idea of having no king or resisting the king, this is an unusual concept that has to be justified, um, uh, because rebelling against the king is essentially treason. So again, what seeds were planted that forced or that enabled, I should say, the American colonials to throw off their loyalty to their king? Um, at first, it was simply immediate history. Remember the 7 Years' War, which technically lasted for 9 years, but that depends on where you want to start it. Sometimes called the French Indian War. You read about this in the previous readings. We talked a little about it as well. But one of the key issues there, I'll go back here for a second. One of the key issues there was this conflict. We have the British, the English colonies at war with the French expansion issues here. And as a result of the conflict, in a nutshell, the French lose. Um, and so here's the map showing, you can see there, these are the areas where the conflict was centered. And this is why many historians refer to um, the 7 Years' War as the first really global conflict, because there was a war was waged in three continents, essentially North America, Europe, and Asia. But as a result, the British gained the upper hand, and you see the expanse. This is really the beginning of the Rule Britannia, where the sun never sets on the British Empire. You can see all the red there, where the British Empire gained a number of territories and areas around the globe where they were able to influence. Now, this tremendous gain did provide Britain with revenue, but it also was extremely costly, and the war itself was costly, which drove them to do a number of things. One of which was to raise the taxes, and this is where the disputes come in between the colonies and their British colonial rulers. Is the taxation, and the taxation was basically saying, the British were saying, look, we defended you against the French. You could have been conquered by the French and become a French colony, but because of British military prowess, we were successful in defeating the French. And so once the French were defeated, what the colonials had hoped to do was to be able to expand westward. So here's the 13 colonies. They were hoping to expand into this region here, which the British made an Indian reserve for indigenous communities. This was the proclamation of 1763, which forced colonials to stay dependent on Britain. So that was part of it, right? It wasn't just simply the British were concerned about protecting indigenous land. It was also they didn't want the colonials to move westward and then become interdependent, become dependent on themselves, I should say, rather than remain coastal and dependent on British goods, British resources, British economy. So two things were going on there, and that irritated the colonials because they also fought in the French Indian War. They also fought and died and risked a great deal. George Washington was a key military commander during that conflict. And it was like, we fought for this war. We fought so we can expand westward. And now the proclamation of 1763, we're not able to do so. And then, of course, the other thing that was irritating for the colonials was the continued insistence on mercantilism. And just quickly, in a nutshell, what mercantilism talks about is that you have the mother country there, which is Britain in this case. They import raw materials at low prices from the colony A, and then they export finished products at high prices back to colony A. So the colonies weren't able to manufacture, weren't allowed to manufacture goods. They had to send the raw materials to the mother country. Whether this was textiles like cotton, for example, would be sent back to Britain, turned into cloth and clothing, and then sent back and sold to the colonials. Wood products, so lumber would be sent to the mother country, and then chairs and other manufactured goods would be sent back to the colony. And notice there was a constant, the mother country got richer and wealthier, grew in power and influence. The colonies were always at the bottom end, in addition to the mother country collecting taxes. And you have colony B, which also, exports raw materials to the mother country, and then imports those goods back from the mother country. But colony A and colony B were not permitted to actually trade between themselves. Now, this was going on secretly under the table. The colonies were, in fact, trading because you can get cheaper goods and other resources and so on and so forth. But mercantilism itself, enforcing this process, puts the colonies at a significant disadvantage. So, this is another sort of very practical, on the surface cause of the revolution. And then the taxation, most famously with the Boston Tea Party. You can read about this more in your textbook. But this idea of no taxation without representation. So British Parliament was just passing tax laws. They weren't actually as unreasonable as the colonials made them out to be. And many colonials recognized that. They recognized that the taxes weren't exceptionally burdensome. And certainly after the American Revolutionary War, once it was finished, the taxation on the colonies, on the states, were much higher, was much worse than under British control. But it was really about the principle, about the fact that, hey, you can't just impose taxes on us without us having representation, without us actually having say into what's going on here. And so we look at the timeline, the Revolutionary War. You can bring it back to the French Indian War, and then things like the Stamp Act, Townshend Acts. These are taxation acts. You got the Boston Massacre in 1770, the Boston Tea Party in 1773, the Intolerable Act, 1774. And then you have the First Continental Congress, where they, in 1774, when they say, okay, we've got to address this. There's a lot of inequity going on here. 1775, Washington crosses the Delaware. Let's just move on there, see if I can get this more clear. And a number of key conflicts underway. You have Benedict Arnold becomes a traitor in 1780, the Articles of Confederation, the Siege of Yorktown, and the war finally ends. And America becomes its own nation. So it's a long, drawn-out process, which, if you go back to the previous slide here, began in 1754 with the French Indian War, the 7 Years' War, and some of these issues. And then it isn't until significantly later, a few decades later, that the war finally ends. And America does become independent. So there's a number of causes here. And again, you can read about this in our textbook, which deals with a lot of those very immediate causes, the taxes and so on, and the particular wars and battles that are fought. The Revolutionary War is a fascinating one, where George Washington in particular takes full advantage of sort of guerrilla warfare, and this idea of sort of a ragtag, undisciplined group of militia soldiers fighting against the highly disciplined British. And although most of the battles the Americans lost, it was at a high cost for the British, and the Americans won some battles as well. Some of it a stroke of, I'll use the word good luck in sort of air quotes there, but providence, or however you want to play it out. But the Americans finally succeed after a long and protracted war, where the British were unable to, particularly because of the Atlantic Ocean, the distance, and the fact that the United States didn't really have a main capital. If you were to invade England, if you take out London, you've essentially defeated England. You take out Paris, you've defeated France. Whereas in 13 colonies, there was no central capital that you could take out. And so although you could you know, take over. The British would defeat various key cities along the way, but the actual army, the Continental Army, would just relocate, and the vast majority of the colonial population was not in urban areas, anyways. They were spread out along farms and so on. So it was very hard to make a decisive victory, whether symbolically defeating the Americans by taking out, like today, if you take out Washington, you've kind of symbolically undermined the United States. It's still not undermined, but there's something symbolic there. But there was nothing like that for the British. They couldn't just symbolically take over anything or strategically or tactically defeat the Americans. They just kept moving and retreating and relocating and then picking away or chipping away at British forces. Okay, but the main focus, again, what I wanted to zero in on in this lecture was the ideas and influences behind the American Revolution. So the specific causes you can take a look at in our textbook reading. Kidd does a great job at summarizing those things for us. What I want to zero in on is some of the ideological reasons behind it. And eventually the formation of this concept, which Abraham Lincoln articulates quite a bit later, in the middle of the Civil War in 1863, during his famous Gettysburg Address, where he ends that address with this beautiful summary of what democracy is all about, or the American republicanism is all about. It's government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. So how do we get here? How do we get to this kind of concept of, rather than having a king, having people ruling? That's the question. Obviously, you go back to the Athenian democracy as a real seed for this. The Renaissance was well underway by this point, particularly in the English-speaking world. So the Renaissance began in Italy, in the 1300s, 1400s, and slowly worked its way into Northern Europe. By the 1600s, it was in England. Think of writers like Shakespeare, for example. Shakespeare is a English Renaissance writer, even though he's writing a couple hundred years after Dante, for example, who's an Italian Renaissance poet. You can see it took a while for the ideas of the Renaissance to creep its way northward. And so by this point, it's in the 1600s where you have Shakespeare. The English Renaissance is also when the Puritans are coming over and establishing. So they kind of brought with them, this rebirth, this reinterest in Greco-Roman ideas. And so democracy was there. The Athenian democracy would be well known in people's minds. Also well known are the failures of the Athenian democracy, right? The issue of who can actually vote in the Athenian democracy. Not everyone had the vote, as is the case. It's still the case today. I mean, if you're 14 years old, you can't vote, even though you're a Canadian citizen, for example. So we still have limitations on voting. And we have people who, they're immigrants, but they're not necessarily citizens, don't have the right to vote. So there are some limitations to voting, even today. But the Athenian democracy in its original state, it had to be men, had to be citizens, and so on and so forth. But they also ran into the problem of the tyranny of the majority. This is what we see in Athenian democracy, is that sometimes, a clever speaker, a sophist, for example, can convince, the voting body to exile someone, right, to ostracize someone, or to sentence them to death, for example, based on other reasons than simply what's true. Most famously, Socrates, for example, was put on trial, and although he was essentially innocent, he was sentenced to death by hemlock. And he was since vindicated by Plato's writings and so on. But it's an example where even democracy can fail and kill one of their greatest citizens. And so there's some problems with democracy, direct representation, and we'll see how the Americans resolve that. But beyond the actual Athenian democracy, the Greek philosophers also had an impact. By this point, Aristotle had made its way back into European thinking, into Western thinking. It was lost for a time. Plato was sort of the dominant philosophical thinker in the Western world, if you're familiar with Plato's rationalism versus Aristotle's, I'm going to use the word empiricism. He's not exactly an empiricist, but he certainly was interested in things of this world and he wasn't a pragmatist either, but his philosophy is far more practical or applicable than Plato's was. And we'll see how this influenced U.S. thinking. And again, this isn't a philosophy course, but you may have encountered the Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle introduces a number of key concepts. And for our purposes, what I want to zero in on are the concepts that relate to the creation of the Declaration of Independence. And what he argues in Nicomachean Ethics is this idea that what each of us want is a happy life in the fullest sense of the phrase. And he'll unpack what happiness means. But you can see happiness is a key. And again, you'll see this in just a moment. When you talk about the Declaration of Independence, happiness is one of the goals, the end goals of what state should be accomplishing. So what will give us this? This is what Aristotle argues: the fullest development and exercise of our capabilities that is compatible with living in a society. Now, this is basically saying that to give us happiness, every citizen, thinking politically now, needs to have the opportunity to develop their abilities. So this concept will drive education. Why Americans are in the forefront of public education historically. One of the reasons is because they want to give everyone an opportunity to develop their skills and abilities, and not just simply to become a better individual and to get rich, but to develop your abilities so that you can then serve society. So there's very much a developing individual gifts, but then giving back to the society. And that's a very, if you think of sort of American cultural ideology, which is certainly true in Canada as well, which drives our system, which has been influenced by the Americans, it's this idea: how can we help people become the best they can be, while also contributing to society? And so when you look at the Declaration of Independence, there it is in focus, that idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So Jefferson adds this concept, which finds its origin in Aristotle. Aristotle also talks about in his Nicomachean Ethics 3 forms of happiness. Again, he talks about the life of pleasure and enjoyment. So again, let's fast forward to the United States. Even today, think of Americans' emphasis on pleasurable experiences: the theme park, right? The amusement park, roller coasters, Disney World, entertainment, Hollywood, music, fast food, ice cream. The sort of pleasure and enjoyment are still a key piece of the American culture. It's important to America, is this idea that pleasure and enjoyment matter. But we also see life as a free and responsible citizen. Again, if you just took Aristotle out of this picture, you could say this is still the American's position, cultural position, intellectual position on what happiness entails. And then thirdly, life as a thinker, a philosopher, which is also a big part of the United States. I know we tend to sometimes stereotype Americans as, maybe not doing too well on standardized tests or all these different things that sometimes Americans get knocked for. But remember, they're still the most innovative nation on earth. United States is the world leader with new patents, so innovating new ideas in all fields, from the sciences and medicine to technology to creativity, advances in filmmaking and other areas. The Americans are the world leaders in terms of patents. They also hold among other nation among the highest, if not the highest, number of Nobel Peace Prizes, for example, in making innovations and so on. So there's these three elements definitely define or shape, and they come from Aristotle originally, imported through that Renaissance, through the English Renaissance, into the minds of the American founding fathers. So happiness is a key part of the American cultural identity. And also that in these 3 areas, being a life of pleasure, being a responsible citizen, being a thinker, a philosopher, these 3 areas that we've touched on to give us happiness, they need to be approached in moderation. And this is the idea of the golden mean, which Aristotle didn't come up with. He just simply articulated that very clearly and very well, and applied it to social political contexts. And so this is Aristotle's doctrine of moderation, which is incredibly practical. Everything in moderation, which the Apostle Paul picks up as well, talking about the Christian life. So even though Aristotle is a pagan, doesn't know the gospel, truth is truth wherever it's found. If it's God, I mean, it's God's. If it's true, then it's God's truth. And even people like Aristotle can unpack these things that are true and can be applied. In Aristotle's book Politics, he makes this very famous statement: man by nature is a political animal. And so he says that this is a philosopher, McGee, sort of paraphrasing this, there are, Aristotle insists, inescapable social and political dimensions to any happy personal life. So what Aristotle's Politics is an application of Aristotle's ethics. So what Aristotle says, this is what makes a happy life. Then he says, now politics, how does a political framework enable citizens to lead happy lives? And so this is what's called the, you'll see in just a minute here, this is called the enabling view of state. I have your quote from Leland Ryken: the aim of education was the enlightened use of leisure time, is another concept that Aristotle brings forward. But with this political nature, that because humans are political by nature, you need to do what's called the enabling view of state, that the function of the state, the function of government, is to make possible the development, and happiness of the individual. This theory becomes the bedrock of American thinking, as opposed to monarchical or tradition or other means by which you can have a happy life. Another Greco-Roman influence, besides Athenian democracy and besides the thinking of Aristotle, is, of course, the Roman Republic. We're not going to spend a ton of time on this, although it's a topic near and dear to me. I love examining the Roman Republic, which ultimately fails, but it is a Roman Republic mythologically and probably somewhat historically is a response to the tyranny of bad monarchy, the tyranny of bad kings. So the Roman Republic comes at the end of this period of Roman kings, and the final Roman king is expelled due to supreme injustice. You can look that up. But then what's established instead is the Republic, which is a thing of the people. And we'll talk more about this later, and you can certainly read about this, but here's just a quick comparison chart showing you the similarities between the Roman Republic. So you have, in Rome, you had an executive branch of government. In this case, it was 2 consuls who were elected for a 1-year term, and they were commander-in-chief of the army. In the United States, it's not 2 consuls, but one president elected by the people for a 4-year term. So get the idea of a term limit. You can see some similarities there. And it's the chief executive, the president is the chief executive of the government, as well as, in the United States as well, commander-in-chief of the army. Then you have the legislative branch. You have the Senate. Then you have an assembly. In the US, you have the Senate as well, and the House of Representatives. We'll talk about those balances, checks and balances, a little bit later in the lecture. Then you have the judicial branch, and you have 8 judges. In the US, you have 9 judges. The 9 is to make sure that there's never a tie. That's certainly a failing point in Roman judicial branch, that you could have 4 judges voting against 4 judges. Whereas in the Supreme Court of the U.S., 9 judges keeps that. There's always going to be a 5-4 split, one way or another. And then the legal code. So there's the 12 tablets, was an attempt to publicly list and articulate the laws of the Roman legal system. And of course, in the United States, it's the Constitution itself, which is the fundamental law. And then citizenship, all male landowners, and now today in the US, all native-born or naturalized adults are citizens as well. So some definite connections there. When the founding fathers were sort of cooking up and developing their constitution, developing their framework for governing, they drew heavily on Roman ideas as well. Now, what other influences are there? Meanwhile, let's fast forward in history a little bit to England. And let's take a look at this. one of the most significant documents actually that was produced in England, not so beyond Roman times, was the in 1215 the Magna Carta. A lot of folks are unaware of the Magna Carta as a significant document. Um, Certainly, if you go to Washington, D.C., and you look at things like the Constitution Declaration on display there by National Archives, they also have copies of, or a copy of, the Magna Carta. There are several copies. This is one of them from 1215. There it is right there, written in Latin, um, a bit difficult to read. But what the Magna Carta attempted to do was to limit the authority of the king. So you have your king. It was King John. He's the if you've seen the Disney Robin Hood cartoon, you know, the lion who sucks his thumb, and Robin Hood is the fox. It's this king. It's King John. He's the thumb sucking lion. He wasn't quite as bad as he's made out to be in that cartoon. But nevertheless, the nobles forced him to sign the Magna Carta, which seriously reduced the power, his power as a king, limited his ability. So the idea of an absolute monarch is restricted in 1215, is restricted by the Magna Carta. This is considered, the Magna Carta is considered Europe's first written constitution, and it's like a charter of rights. And what it does is it says the law is king, not king is king, but even the king is subject to the law. And that concept will continue later on. Today in Canada, we call ourselves a constitutional monarchy. So we still have a king. Right now, we've got King Charles the Third is sitting on the throne. He's Canada's king. He's Canada's head of state. But we are a constitutional monarchy. Even above the king is, of course, our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Our Constitution is more important. Other things that are guaranteed in the Magna Carta: no taxation unless a common consensus is in place. All free men have right to justice, fair trial. We get this idea of habeas corpus. You can't just imprison people without cause, without legitimate cause, and we still have habeas corpus on our legal system in the United States as well as in Canada and other places around the world. You know, we talk about unlawful imprisonment, and there's a term limit as well. You can't just be imprisoned indefinitely and never be accused of anything. This, by the way, explains why the U.S. operates Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. If you're wondering if you've heard about, you know, terrorists from 9/11 being held without being put on trial, it's sort of a way for the American government to skirt habeas corpus by keeping people indefinitely in prison at Guantanamo Bay. That's another discussion, another debate for another time. But this is a key document. This is a very, very important document historically, not only for the United States, but for the world, the Magna Carta. All right, so you can see again, we talk about some of these words and language. You can see how these things will also intellectually influence the idea of the Americans rebelling against or defying royal rule. All right, so fast forward again to the future. Now we're talking about King James the First. King James, this is the King James Bible dude. His reign, there it is, 1603 to 1625. And he did bring back this idea of absolutism and divine right of kings. So he kind of rebelled against Magna Carta by this point. So we're 400 years in from the Magna Carta, and you know, he's challenging these ideas that no, the king has absolute authority. And you see elsewhere, like in France, for example, the absolute monarch is also on the rise. But King James attempts it. He does other things. I mean, he's an important monarch, and we're not going to go too far looking at British monarchical history, but it's important to recognize that he was a key player with the formation of the King James Bible, but also this idea of absolute authority. It comes back. King James is also the guy who was you know, Jamestown in Virginia is named after this particular king. So he's an important individual during the development of the colonies. But he did sort of create this divide. We also have this sort of Protestant Catholic divide, and you might be familiar with Guy Fawkes, the gunpowder plot where Guy Fawkes attempted as a terrorist, as a reaction to oppression of Catholics, actually, Catholic people in England, to blow up Parliament, which was heavily Protestant. So the gunpowder plot, all these explosives put underneath in the basement of Parliament, fortunately was not set off. We also get this, today we have the Anonymous or whatever, these sort of cyber terrorist groups using this mask. That's a Guy Fawkes mask. So it's named after this guy who attempted to blow up Parliament and defy the monarch and establish again. What he was hoping for was to establish a Catholic monarchy again in England. Then you got Charles the First, who essentially felt that he had royal prerogative, and he further limited the provisions of the Magna Carta. So here you have sort of, this is almost like a template for what the Americans did later when they saw their rights being restricted by King George III. So this is kind of a dry run, or kind of from an American perspective, looking in, how do things play out? Now, I should say, while these things were playing out, the colonies were fairly, they were not really interested what was happening with Charles I in England. They were still royalists, still supporting the crown, and they didn't really notice because they were doing their own thing, just trying to survive. But he did impose taxes without the Parliament. So essentially, remember I said the Magna Carta says that you can't impose taxes unless there's a common consensus. And so that became known as Parliament. So Parliament would justify taxes, would impose taxes, and Charles is like, forget it, I don't need Parliament input whatsoever. And so Parliament did attempt. There he is. His crown's getting big again. So it's a return to pre-Magna Carta absolutism. The Petition of Rights in 1628, Parliament said, hey, there can't be any taxes without Parliament's consent. No English subjects should be imprisoned without cause, habeas corpus, which Charles was doing. So reinforcing this idea of habeas corpus. No quartering of soldiers in citizens' homes, and no martial law may be used in peacetime. So we're just reminding Charles of what are the rules that were given with the Magna Carta. But Charles is like, whatever, right? Meh, I don't care. I'm not affected by this. I'm the king. I can do as you will. And during this time, we also saw the extreme oppression of primarily, you have the Puritans fleeing here, but the parliamentarians were predominantly Protestant, predominantly Puritan. And this is that John Winthrop sitting on a hill and coming to Plymouth Rock, all that kind of stuff happening during this time period. What happened after that was the English Civil War, which the colonies sort of remained separate from, even though it was Puritans against the Royalists primarily, and the colonies were primarily Puritan as well. They didn't want to weigh in as the Civil War was unfolding. And so that's an interesting thread as well to take a look at some point, why the Puritans in the colonies were less favorable towards the Civil War of their compatriots. But the Civil War, caused division in England, and the Royalists were defeated. And Parliament won the day, and Charles I was sentenced to death. Oliver Cromwell has his head chopped off. There's the king getting beheaded. Sorry for a graphic image here, but there's a horrible image of the king's head. And again, I mean, this is going to have a lasting impact in the colonies. Is it legal to rebel against your king? Is it treason or not? And the Civil War sort of provided a model or template about how this plays out. Now, just fast forward a bit. I'm going through British history very quickly here. But Charles II eventually is reestablished on the throne. There he is, Charlie II. As I said, right now we've got Charles III. And let's fast forward a bit here into the future. Again, all these things are sort of laying a foundation for American thinking. You have the Glorious Revolution. So bringing of a strong Protestant king, William of Orange, is brought to the throne. And what he does in 1689 is, with the Parliament, he established what's known as the English Bill of Rights. Now, take a look at these things. This sounds very much like the U.S. Constitution. This sounds very much like the U.S. Bill of Rights, and very much linked to the Declaration of Independence. Things like the right to trial by jury, the right to private property, freedom from the presence of a standing army in times of peace. These concepts will be revisited in U.S. history. Freedom from the presence of the freedom from cruel or unusual punishment, freedom from excessive bail or fines, the right to bear arms, the right to petition, the writ of habeas corpus, and the freedom from taxation without representation. Okay, that's the battle cry. We heard that with the Boston Tea Party and these various taxes. And so the Americans are actually referring back to this 1689 document, the English Bill of Rights. And of course, there you see that one there, the right to bear arms, which we think is a kooky American concept that was cooked up much later. It is fundamental in 1689, quite a bit earlier than the amendment in the U.S. Bill of Rights in their Constitution. All right, so fast forward again. See, these are the seeds of definitely the seeds of democratic thinking, Republican thinking in the United States. Another intellectual concept, of course, is the Enlightenment. This is the 1700s, the age of reason, and so it's very telling that it's during this time of the intellectual history of the world that the Americans are actually trying to devise a new system of government. And when they eventually throw off colonial rule, they have it's a blank slate. They get to create a brand new country from scratch, essentially. And the fact that it happens during the Enlightenment causes them to think, well, rationally, to come up with causes and reasons, and to weigh out the consequences of their choices, and say, intellectually, we can actually create. And again, there's that word, almost a utopic society. How can we create a perfect society? Let's put our heads to it. Because in Europe, there's all the baggage of tradition, all the baggage of religious conflict and wars, all the baggage of the monarchical system and entrenched aristocracy and competing ideas. Let's just throw all that aside and start from scratch. And so that's important as well, that this happens during the Enlightenment. And in many ways, the Enlightenment has given us all sorts of useful things as well as harmful things. But obviously advances in science and technology and rights and the free market system, advances in space sciences, and so on and so forth. And we'll talk more about Adam Smith, but I think it's ideas like capitalism. Can we think of a great way to run our economic system, for example? And Smith says this: what are the advantages which we propose by the great purpose of human life, which we call bettering our condition? So this idea from Adam Smith, the idea that how can we make everyone's life better? Again, in Europe, the concept was it's not really a caste system. If you look at, Indian caste system with reincarnation and the Dalits versus the Brahmins, it's not like that. But in Europe, there was still this sort of idea from the Middle Ages of, aristocrats or worthy people, and you have your merchants and your nouveau riche and your artisan class, and then you have your serfs. So there's kind of this hierarchy. And so Adam Smith's proposing the idea, how can we make everyone's life better? Is there a way to do this? And you can see that becomes a key piece in driving American development, American thinking about economics. Not at first for everyone. Obviously, we're talking about white males, but eventually, how can we raise the quality of life for everyone? And you'll see this in the United States, that the quality of life for Americans has certainly gone up due to the presence of the United States, due to their thinking, and subsequently, American influence globally has raised the quality of life for a large swath of the human population. There's still poverty, there's still disparities in the world, certainly, but oftentimes some of those disparities are a result of other localized problems. So political corruption, instability, warfare, drought, other factors. Generally speaking, capitalism is certainly a better system than socialism. You might disagree with that. That's okay. But we'll see more about that a little bit later, particularly with Alexander Hamilton applying capitalist thinking to not wealth redistribution, but wealth creation. All right, so leave that for now. Another key Enlightenment thinker is John Locke. And he talks about the purpose of state is life, liberty, and property. Notice that Thomas Jefferson swaps out property with happiness, pursuit of happiness. but property is there as well. And the reason why Jefferson does that is because he feels that happiness encompasses more than just property. It does encompass property. So the right to have property is part of happiness, right? You own properties, you can take care of it, you can maintain it, you can invest in it, you can expand it, you can develop it. But there's other ways that you can find happiness, going all the way back to that Aristotelian Nicomachean ethics. Also, he says that government is for serving the people. Right? This is a paradigm shift in thinking. In some monarchical systems, the government exists for the king's pleasure, for the king's benefit, not the benefit of the people. Although it does go hand in hand. It's not as if the king only served himself or the queen's only served herself, but there was a serious shift in thinking that the primary goal of government is, in fact, for serving the people. That's going to have a huge impact. And just again, this seems to be a pretty philosophical lesson today, but how do we know what is right or what is wrong? There's a number of ways we can determine what's right or wrong. You can use Enlightenment method like thinking and logic. Today, we tend to rely on feelings. If it feels right, then it must be right. The Americans also give us practicality or pragmatism. If it works, then it must be right. You have tradition. If this is what we've always done, then it must be right. For Christians, it's revelation. So what does the Bible say? But also, other religions, the Torah, the Quran, the Vedas, and so on. And then there's number 6, natural law. So intrinsically know. We intrinsically know what's right or wrong. And then number 7 is consensus. If we all believe something is right or wrong. And so this is an issue, right? If you're studying ethics, it gets more complex than this. But these are the issues that even the Americans were trying to sort out and wrestle with as they were developing their new nation, developing their constitution, and even writing this document, the Declaration of Independence, and subsequently the Constitution. How do we know what's right? And as a result, what they rely on, this is from Ben Franklin suggests this edit, that what they rely on is actually natural law, that there are certain things that just we all know that are just absolutely true. And the other question is, what is truth? Are certain truths self-evident? Are there universal truths? What is natural law? And of course, natural law is the concept. So that's a key Enlightenment idea that undergirds not just from the Enlightenment, this comes from other previous thinking, but the Enlightenment brought to the fore that it says that ethics and philosophy, that human beings possess intrinsic values that govern their reasoning and behavior. Natural law maintains that those rules of right and wrong are inherent in people and are not created by society or court judges. Christians differ in their view of natural law. There are some Christians who would argue that natural law is another way of saying that we are made in the image of God, and that God has some communicable attributes, so our sense of justice, our sense of what's right and wrong is there. So there is some biblical truth to this. Again, we're not going to debate is natural law a thing or not. Certainly the Americans held to that when they were framing their declaration, when they were framing their Constitution. Now, this article is posted in your optional readings as a link. Just came out recently, 2023, as from Crossway. And the title of the essay is "We Do Not Hold These Truths to Be Self-Evident." And what's interesting that when Jefferson originally penned that phrase, this is what he wrote. He said, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." And what Jefferson's doing is he's connecting this life, liberty, this we're all created equal concept. He's connecting it to the divine. He's connecting to the fact that we do have value as human beings because we're made in the image of God. That idea, and it's Ben Franklin, who was not a Christian, who crossed out the last 3 words and replaced them with this: self-evident. And so this becomes the iconic phrase that we know it as. Again, let me just read that for you. From the Constitution. It says, "We hold these truths to be not sacred and undeniable, but self-evident." What? That all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator, so God's still there, with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if you have a chance to take a look at that that article. It's an excellent article that talks about this issue. What they argue is that that in fact Jefferson was right the first time. This is what the author says, Wilson. He says, equality and human rights are sacred truths, not self-evident ones. They are irreducibly theological, grounded in specifically Judeo-Christian beliefs about God and his creation of human beings in his image. And there is no particular reason why societies with different theological foundations should not reach very different conclusions, and many have. And this is true. So many cultures, many nations historically have not valued human rights and have not valued and have put people in various classes and differences. Some nations culturally and even legally, systematically entrench racist and ethnic discriminatory policies to this day because they don't have a Judeo-Christian or a Christian, exclusively Christian undergirding. And so this brings us to another key and often overlooked concept behind the Declaration, behind the American shift to independence, and that is the Great Awakening. We touched on this a little bit. It's in our readings a little bit, but we come back to it. This is where you had, just prior to the War for Independence, you had this great spiritual awakening. You had this great shift where George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, and other preachers were bringing people back to the gospel. And just to quickly summarize things, with the Great Awakening, it was a spiritual revival, but it also encouraged the notion of individualism and individual rights, that we all have an obligation to be in relationship with God. It's not just because your parent or grandparent was an elder in the church or went to church, but you have to have a personal relationship with God, and that there's some accountability there. These kinds of ideas become important in the political and social context with the United States. We also have this revisiting of the divine purpose of America. So again, we're back to City Upon a Hill from Winthrop's speech in 1630, that America has an obligation to be an example of what a godly nation looks like. And if England has diverged or been unfaithful to its divine purpose towards as a king or a monarch, then you have a right to rebel against that. And John Calvin talked about that as well, that if a monarch fails to do his or her duty as a monarch in serving the people, in governing, maintaining peace, wielding the sword, the way the Apostle Paul talks about the authority, then citizens can, in fact, legitimately rebel against that governance. So that's the idea. Here's just sort of an anecdotal example. Early revolutionary forces, in an attempt on their way to attack Quebec, actually. Remember, we don't think of Quebec as a British colony, but at this point, after the 7 Years' War, it becomes under British control. And the Continental Army was doing sort of to try to open a different theater of conflict. They went to attack, on their way to attack Quebec during the Revolutionary War. They actually went to George Whitefield's tomb, which is in the United States, and they opened the tomb and they took a portion of his collar. And Benedict Arnold was actually there. He eventually becomes a traitor, but he takes the collar off the body and cuts it into small pieces and gives each person, each commander, a piece of Whitefield's, almost like relics, for example, to help them in the conflict. So you can still see that there's this sort of somehow the Great Awakening has spiritual significance. Somehow Whitefield is a bit of a saint, and there's also people testifying that the ghost of Whitefield was assaulting the British, and some unusual spectral things going on during this time. But besides that, I think spiritually, intellectually, there's this undergirding that America has a divine purpose that supersedes even kings. But secondly, that they have an obligation to be this spiritual example, to create a good society, a Christian society for the world to see and to emulate. All right, zipping along here, we're almost through this, through some of these tracing this intellectual thread with the Declaration, with the Revolutionary War, and with the Constitution. In January 10th, 1776, Thomas Paine publishes what's known as Common Sense. Common Sense, this is taken from online encyclopedia. Common Sense is a 47-page pamphlet, really, um, advocating independence from Great Britain to people in the 13 colonies. Writing in clear and persuasive prose, Paine collected various moral and political arguments to encourage common people in the colonies to fight for egalitarian government. It was published anonymously at the beginning of the American Revolution and became an immediate success. It sold 120,000 copies, which is a huge bestseller by a long shot. And it was estimated that 10 people read each copy. So essentially everyone, almost everyone who could read or be read to. So if you're looking for the common cause, the Common Sense is a key document where Paine lays out the intellectual reasoning for why you should rebel against the monarchy. Well, what was the gist? Well, the Common Sense, here are the key points that he makes, summarized by a guy named Kiger in 2023. He says, the government's purpose is to serve the people. So again, reiterating what Locke had said. He says that having a king is a bad idea. So he articulates and gives the reasoning for why a monarchical system doesn't work. And I think even today, I hear these same arguments being spouted by people at Tim Hortons, for example, why we need to jettison Charlie III as Canada's king. So it's still a raging debate. And he makes some great arguments for why a monarchical system is not a good system. And one of it is, it's really luck of the draw. You get the king who's next in line, hereditary king, versus you get the ruler, instead of getting the ruler that should rule or deserves to rule or is capable of ruling based on democratic votes. He makes the argument that America is home of the free. So we get this idea, and this is carried forward, right? Land of the free, a home of the brave, land of the brave, home of the free. These ideas are there. It's articulated here very clearly and very powerfully. He also says that America has a rare opportunity to create a new nation based on self-rule. So this is that blank slate. It's a great opportunity that we can actually succeed in creating this new utopia, using the Enlightenment thinking, using our minds, develop a powerful system. He argues for a strong central government. This doesn't come into play until after the Civil War, so another 100 years before this idea is taken into consideration. But he certainly argues logically for that. And later, when Abraham Lincoln and others moved towards a stronger federal government in the 1860s, they refer back to Paine, this Common Sense, his arguments there. So those are the sort of key ideas, which are then, so that's in January 1776. By June, July, the Declaration is drafted and written. And again, we have this disparity here. All men are created equal, but not really. That still has to be worked out and is still being worked out historically in the United States and certainly around the world. Just a few more Enlightenment thinkers. Montesquieu, French writer, thinker. He's the guy who comes up with this idea of separation of powers. And so he articulated this idea of separation of powers. We'll talk about that in just a second, which leads to this other notion of checks and balances. So if you pay attention to American politics, even American news, you'll hear this checks and balances concept, which becomes articulated in the U.S. Constitution. And here's what it looks like. Again, drawing from the Roman Republican ideas, but here's the actual, this is what the Americans came up with. And this is still basically how government functions. At the very, very top is the U.S. Constitution. So again, remember the Magna Carta, the law is king. They brought this forward with the Constitution at the top, the legal framework for every U.S. law that's passed. Every citizen needs to be governed by the Constitution. But the Constitution also outlines the role of federal government and its relation to the states, its citizens, and the people. And there have also been, right now, as of today, 27 amendments to the Constitution. And the first 10 amendments, start with the First Amendment, Second Amendment, Third Amendment, those first 10 amendments are what becomes known as the Bill of Rights. So this is where you have your freedom of religion is guaranteed, freedom of the press, freedom of to bear arms, those kinds of things. Now, in articulating the powers of government, there's the three branches that the Romans had, a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judiciary. Canada has something similar. The legislative branch is even more divided. So Congress consists of the Senate and the House of Representatives. So here's an interesting innovation. In order to balance and protect minorities from majorities, the smaller states and the big states, based on population, all have equal number of senators. Okay, so every state, I think, has two senators per state. Whether you're Delaware or whether you're California, whether you're New Hampshire or whether you're Florida or whatever, Texas, no matter how big your economy is, no matter how big your population is, you all have equal representation in the Senate. Now, what about the big states? Shouldn't they have a say as well? Well, then you have the House of Representatives, which is now proportional to your population. So bigger states like California, bigger populations like New York, will have more seats in the House of Representatives. But the Senate and the House of Representatives, work together as Congress. So it's a check and balance. It's to protect the minority from the majority, right? But also to protect the majority from the minority. Both can be out of balance. So Congress consists of those two checks and balances. The executive branch, we've already touched on that already. Similar to Rome, the president has executive power, has veto power, and is commander in chief over the government. So the armed forces. So what that means is that you're less likely to have a military coup because the head of the military is in fact the president, a citizen, not a soldier. And then you have the judiciary, the Supreme Court, and their job is to interpret the law. You see down below, Congress makes the laws, the president enforces the law, and the Supreme Court interprets the law. And they interpret it all under the authority, the ultimate authority of the U.S. Constitution. Well, so there's the history there behind this great document and subsequent the Constitution. There's more that we can say about the intellectual background here, but you can see that these things don't occur or appear in a vacuum, that there's a long history of different philosophical, intellectual ideas, as well as historical events like taxation, the various taxes, and the Stamp Act, and so on. So all these things work together to give us this birth of a new nation, a new republic, a nation the world has never seen before. To be able to design almost from scratch, but based on all these great ideas that before them, to develop a fresh nation. Still dealing with the issues of indigenous populations, or ignoring issues of indigenous population, still ignoring the issues of slavery, although certainly debate raged. If you follow closely the debate over the Constitution, even the debate, as I mentioned, even the Declaration, debate of slavery continually played a hand in this, but hadn't changed. Change takes time. And it's hard to say for people who are suffering in chains and suffering during injustices. But we do know that the push towards not having slavery, the push towards abolition of slavery, is something that has been a big part, also a thread, a stream in U.S. history. There are people, predominantly Christians, but others as well, who were opposed to slavery from the get-go, in fact. And it's just a matter of continuing to fight for what is right, for what is true. And thankfully, slavery was finally abolished. Thankfully, we've made tremendous headways with Jim Crow laws being abolished and anti-segregation laws being abolished in the United States. But still, there's a long road to go, as is evident by many who still experience discrimination, ethnic discrimination, and so on in the United States. But that's all for now. in terms of this lecture. Remember to keep up with the readings for next week, and we'll see you then. Take care.